Good afternoon. My name is Michael Jacobs. I'm a recovering journalist, and I do communications work here at the Center for Israel Education. With me today is Emory University professor Ken Stein, who is the president and founder of the Center for Israel Education. Ken has been teaching about modern Israel and the Middle East and conflict and negotiations for 40 years. In the last 20 years, he's spent a lot of time looking at the ins and outs of the negotiating process, analyzing the sources to understand why they succeeded partially, but not fully. Why we're here today is that next Tuesday, March 26th, is the 40th anniversary of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Negotiating it was very difficult, yet the treaty has remained intact all these years, even if sometimes a little icily between Israel and Egypt. But since that great day in 1979 when those two came together and signed that accord, Israel has only managed to reach a peace treaty with one other country, which was Jordan in 1994, and they failed to negotiate any kind of settlement with the Palestinians as envisioned in the peace treaty. So we want to go back and look at how we got to that day in 1979, why things worked then, why they haven't worked so well since, and what we can look forward to in the years to come. So Ken, to start with, let's go back to June 1967. Israel has just defeated Egypt, Syria, Jordan in the Six-Day War. They've added incredible territory, most significantly for this peace treaty, the Sinai. How did we get from that ceasefire in 1967 to a decade later, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin sitting down at a table and talking?
Well, trying to do that in a half an hour is going to be difficult, but we'll have a run at it. The maps that you see are Israel of pre-June 1967 and post-June 1967. The 67 war, the June War, changed the complexion of the Middle East. It changed the entire nature of Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors. It made Arab states next to Israel begin to consider the possibility of how they might get their lands back from Israel, which he took in this defensive war in early June of 67. And the map on the one side shows you how close Israel was, what its proximity was to its Arab neighbors, particularly Jordan and Egypt. And then the post-67 war shows you Israel in control of Sinai. The key issue which came out of the 1967 war was, is there a possible way for Israel to reach an agreement with its neighbors based on a concept that was known as either land for peace or land for security? And that concept was embedded in a United Nations resolution passed in 1967. There were other parts of the resolution: sovereignty, territorial integrity was supposed to be protected, a resolution of the Palestinian issue, actually the resolution of the refugee issue didn't even mention the word Palestine or Palestinian. And then we flow ourselves through the Nixon and Ford years through to Carter's election in 1977. Of significance is that no real negotiations took place in any serious fashion between 1967 and 1973. The United Nations tried, it wasn't successful. Henry Kissinger was broached secretly by the Egyptians. Would he be interested in trying to broker an arrangement between Egypt's new president Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir? That didn't work. The 73 war unfolded, and Israel found itself in a defensive war in October of 1973. And as soon as the war came to an end, Henry Kissinger put up his hand and said, I'm going to try and reach an understanding between Israel and Egypt through direct talks. And they met directly in 101 kilometers outside of Cairo in November of 1973. And then Kissinger moved quickly to try and achieve a series of disengagement agreements between Egypt and Israel, and a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria. By disengagement agreement, I mean, essentially, Michael, that Israel withdrew from some of the lands that it had taken, and in return, Israel got an agreement that there would not be any further fighting. But there were no treaties signed.
So what is the distinction between a peace treaty and just a disengagement agreement?
Well, it's a great question. The disengagement agreement essentially said, we are going to separate our forces, but we're not going to sign a treaty with you. We're not going to have diplomatic relations with you. And Israel dearly wanted diplomatic relations. Kissinger's process was step by step. He wanted to negotiate one small step at a time. He didn't want to negotiate any political solution because he didn't think it was possible. He knew what the limitations were on his mediation. Jimmy Carter comes to office in 1977 and has a completely different view of what to go forward from here.
Why?
Many presidents, when they come to office, want to be unlike their predecessor. I think we can probably say that about President Trump and vis-a-vis Obama. I think we can say that about Bush vis-a-vis Clinton. It just seems to be what happens. I don't think they actually sit down and say, this is what we want to do, but that's what happens. But Jimmy Carter also came to office with a notion that he believed that a comprehensive peace could be negotiated between Israel and all of her Arab neighbors. And that was an attitude that he brought into the White House in January of 1977 with the stimulation and the impetus of his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski came to the conclusion that he felt all the Arabs could meet together with the Israelis around the table and arrive at a common solution to all the issues that were outstanding. Brzezinski had been part of a study group in 1975 which presented something called the Brookings Report, and it said a comprehensive peace, Palestinian participation, almost Israeli full withdrawal to the territories taken in '67. But the political reality on the ground hadn't changed. In other words, Kissinger didn't do politics because he knew that most Arab states were not yet ready to negotiate with Israel. Brzezinski and Carter and Vance, as the Secretary of State, almost totally overlooked that, and they therefore moved forward toward a comprehensive peace.
We need to get into, obviously, the importance of the election of Menachem Begin and the coup government. Before we do that, Brzezinski and Kissinger, very different backgrounds. How important is it to have a Polish Catholic national security advisor coming in versus a German Jew who was the national security advisor and Secretary of State? How does that influence the perspective on the whole Arab-Israeli conflict?
I don't think anyone did any kind of religious identity for the National Security Council advisor. They both were academics. They both were professors. One was, Kissinger was from Harvard. Brzezinski was from Columbia. I think it was just a different way of looking at politics. And Brzezinski's beauty, or his advantage to Kissinger, is that Brzezinski was advising a man who didn't come to office with a lot of foreign policy experience. Richard Nixon, of course, had an enormous amount of foreign policy experience before he had even chosen Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. So Jimmy Carter really relied a really great deal on Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I think it fed into Carter's view that all problems could be resolved in a comprehensive way if you went ahead and tried to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict with all the Arabs sitting together with the Israelis around the table. Problem was that even the Israel Labor Party that was in office when Carter was elected weren't terribly keen to meeting with all the Arabs in one place at one time because they thought the lowest common denominator would be put before them and there would be pressure on Israel to withdraw from the territories taken in '67. Israel's great preference was to deal bilaterally. They wanted to deal just with one Arab state at a time. And that, therein, was a major difficulty that Carter had with both Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Labor Prime Minister when he was elected, and he had with Menachem Begin, who was elected in May 1977. Israeli prime ministers and Israeli governments don't want to be jumped on diplomatically. They want to be jumped on politically or militarily. They would rather deal with each one of these countries separately. And when Carter came to office, he thought he had Begin. No, he thought he had Rabin as an interlocutor. He ended up having Begin. And no one in the Carter administration even predicted that Begin would be elected. That very first meeting which Begin had with Carter in July of 1977 was really difficult and really tough.
But the Rabin's first meeting with Carter wasn't exactly smooth sailing either, was it?
No, it was difficult as well, because Carter went to Rabin and said, so tell me what your position is. Now tell me what your fallback position is. And Rabin said, I don't have a fallback position. I have one position. I want to negotiate an agreement between my country and my neighbors. And Carter was hoping he could put something in his pocket, and he couldn't. And it was a very sour and poor relationship. In fact, one of the first things Begin did when he came to office, he read the transcript of those minutes between Rabin and Carter that took place in March of 1977. By the time Begin meets with Carter, Carter's already put up his hand and said in public, I think we need a Palestinian homeland. He's already told the Israelis, you cannot sell jets to Ecuador because it contains an American engine, an American-made engine. He was very different in terms of his expression of politics. He was doing it very publicly. And the Israelis had never met an American president who wanted to do his diplomacy in public. After that July meeting, the relationship between the two began to decline, and a high point was reached when the Carter administration tried to bring in the Soviets in October of 1977 as equal partners in convening an international conference. And Begin said, we don't want the Soviets here. And Sadat says, I'm not particularly happy that you invited them here, but it's not my preference. By the time October 77 runs around, Begin has sent his foreign minister to Morocco to meet with the Egyptian vice president, Touhami, in a private meeting. And they get the measure of one another. No promise is made that Israel would withdraw from Sinai, but Touhami goes back to Sadat and says, I think you can work with Begin. And hence, after that, we have Begin's very famous visit to Jerusalem in November of 1977. Sadat, I'm sorry.
So from Carter's perspective, the first shock was Begin defeating Rabin, becoming prime minister. How big a shock was it when Sadat then went to Jerusalem from Carter's perspective, who wanted this grand, comprehensive peace, and now they're going off and doing it without him?
I think the Carter administration was a little shocked. It took them 3 or 4 weeks to sort of accept this reality, and I don't think they were terribly pleased. The interesting part about the Carter administration, even though the Egyptian-Israeli talks, Egyptian-Israeli relations now moved into a bilateral phase of talks that were mediated, negotiated by the Americans in early of 78, the Carter administration never dropped this notion of we have to have a comprehensive peace. What they wanted to do is they wanted to find a way, with this bilateral arrangement that these guys might be working out, could they then make it become a comprehensive peace ultimately? Because after the treaty is signed in 1979 between Egypt and Israel, the Carter administration continuously moves forward with this notion of let's move to a comprehensive peace. Carter administration wanted dearly to get the PLO involved. Privately, secretly, and against American law actually, in the spring and summer of 1977, the Carter administration reached out to Arafat. And Arafat just couldn't say the magic words, I recognize the state of Israel, I accept UN Resolution 242. We get to an impasse in the middle of 1978, and President Carter says, I think it's time for me to try and bring you guys together to talk about something really serious, like an agreement between the two of you.
And that's how we get to Camp David.
That's exactly how we get to Camp David. Now, there are lots of twos and fro's in between there, but basically, Carter believed that the only way he could push for something that would provide for the Palestinians and push for an Egyptian-Israeli relationship would be if he could get them together without the press, without the media, in the Camp David environments in Maryland. And he did that from, I think, the 5th or 6th of September until the 17th when they signed this agreement. And the Camp David Accords are a two-part agreement. One deals with maybe the Palestinians will get something for themselves, which we'll call self-government. And maybe the Israelis and the Egyptians will sign something called a treaty. So the Accords of September 1978 are two parts. One dealing with the potential for Palestinian rights, self-governance, or autonomy. Begin would never have called it self-government because he was afraid, he was desperately afraid that Jimmy Carter's effort at comprehensive peace would ultimately roll down the hill toward Palestinian self-determination, would force the creation of a Palestinian state, would force the Israelis to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. And that was the one thing, both pragmatically and security-wise and ideologically, that Begin refused.
So at Camp David, what does Sadat want? What does Begin want? And how do they wind up having these two parts to the Accords? The one that leads to a treaty of peace, bilateral, and the other that is this envisioning of a comprehensive settlement.
It's curious. I think Sadat knew when he went to Camp David what he wanted most of all was Israel out of Sinai. He wanted the Israeli settlements removed from Sinai. If he had to sign a treaty with Israel, he would do so. Begin wanted to find a way at Camp David to sign a treaty with Egypt, but not leave the West Bank, not provide for the devolution of a Palestinian state. Carter, when he went to Camp David, wanted more than Sadat. He still wanted a comprehensive peace. He still wanted Palestinian self-determination. He still wanted the devolution of a Palestinian state. If we take a look at the documents which were released in the last 6 months by the Israel State Archives, we see that Carter and Vance and Brzezinski tried dearly in the last week of those negotiations in September of 1978 to push the Israelis to a process of devolution toward a Palestinian state. And Begin and Weizmann and Dayan, the three who were the major advisors, along with Aaron Barak, later on the Supreme Court justice who was an advisor to Begin and the Israeli delegation, they said, absolutely not. We're not budging from what we came here with, and that is no Palestinian state, no stoppage in settlements, no withdrawal from the lands that we took in 67, other than maybe Sinai. By the time you get to the second week of the Camp David Accords, Sadat realizes that the Israelis are not going to cave in on self-determination. Carter still is relentless. But Sadat is willing to say to the Israelis, as he says to Ezra Weizmann about the week into the Camp David Accords, we're going to sign an agreement with you. And if we have to give up Palestinian self-determination, we will. Now, those who advised Sadat were terribly angry. Terribly, terribly angry. That Sadat had come to Camp David and was not going to walk away with anything for the Palestinians. Carter understood that what Sadat had done by going to Jerusalem, he needed to deliver something for himself and for Egypt. What Carter also understood, and what his advisors also understood, that as Sadat kept on going closer and closer to the Israelis, he wasn't bringing anything back for the Palestinians, which was alienating his place with his Arab neighbors. And Carter tried to protect Sadat by constantly pushing the Israelis into negotiating with the PLO and the Palestinians, and it proved fruitless. It just proved fruitless. So from the period from September of 1978 until the signing of the peace treaty in 1979, it's some really tough negotiations that go on. I mean, really difficult.
So a lot of people sort of think, okay, Camp David, they signed the Accords September 17th, 1978. Everything else after that is just dotting the I's and crossing the T's to get to the peace treaty. What did they have that were still issues they had to settle when they signed the Accords, and why did it take, when they were supposed to get a treaty in 3 months, it took 6 months, and at many times seemed like this is never going to happen?
The Camp David Accords are full of ambiguities. They're full of side concepts and side letters. And that was a mistake. But the only way you could get an agreement at Camp David, if you could have a side letter, let's say on Jerusalem, or a side letter on future talks, what was not in the Accords was a discussion of how would Israel pay for the new military installations it was going to have to build in Sinai to protect itself because it was withdrawing from two major airfields in Sinai. What was going to happen to Israel's access to oil? Israel had used oil from the Sinai Egyptian oil fields. Who was going to provide that? And it became even more difficult once we get to the end of 1978 and early 79, because the Shah falls. Khomeini comes to power. Israel's no longer having access to the oil that it once had from Tehran. Who's going to supply Israel with the oil? So the Israelis are now going to request of the United States that it guarantee Israel's oil supply for 15 years and promise that Egypt would supply Israel with oil. Now, you didn't know that in September of 78. You only knew that in January of 79 or December of 79, which tells you whenever you make an agreement between countries, the politics of the region are going to come back and bite you, and you can't predict how that's going to affect negotiations that went further. The fact that Iran changed regimes meant the price of oil went up, which meant the price of importing oil in the United States went up, which meant it had a higher price at the gas tank, which Americans didn't particularly like. And then they particularly blame Carter. By the time you get to February of 1979, Carter just wants to tie up this agreement and not let all the details make all the previous negotiations become wasteful and not have a conclusion. And so Carter actually put up his hands and said, I'm going to have other people negotiate this. I can't be as engaged as I was up to now. I'm going to ask Bob Strauss to be an autonomy negotiator. Then I'm going to ask Saul Linowitz, because Carter had to focus on the economy, he had to focus on re-election, he had to focus on other issues that had nothing to do with the Middle East. And still, at the very end of this negotiation, for 4 days in March of 1979, Carter flies out to the Middle East to meet with Begin, to meet with Sadat, to tie it up. That's how difficult it was. So by the time the treaty is signed, there's a lot of bad feeling between the sides. There's a lot of mistrust between the sides. They may have agreed on diplomatic relations between Israel and Egypt. But what didn't move forward was autonomy for the Palestinians.
So one of the real obstacles to getting it to a treaty was this idea of linkage between the Palestinians and self-rule or autonomy or whatever it was going to be, and the pace of getting to fully normal relations between Israel and Egypt.
Correct.
How did that wind up not becoming linked?
Well, the Israelis said, we're not doing this. We're not going to engage in linkage, because if you engage in linkage, what you're going to do is we're going to withdraw from Sinai, and then you're going to slow down diplomatic relations. If we engage in linkage and we don't want to do anything with the Palestinians, we're not going to get the Egyptian-Israeli treaty that we wanted. In other words, the Israelis, to the very end, were absolutely resolute in not allowing the Egyptian-Israeli treaty to be linked to progress with the Palestinians. And I don't know if you want to say it's to Begin's credit, or to Rabin, or Dayan's credit, not Rabin, Weitzman and Dayan's credit, but they were resolute. And Carter just had to say yes. Sadat just had to say yes. Sadat could not allow his Jerusalem visit to go unrewarded. He needed Sinai back. He got Sinai back ultimately in a year after he was assassinated. But what he did receive was an Israeli Knesset, an Israeli parliament vote that said they're going to withdraw from settlements in the Sinai. So Israel withdraws from settlements in the Sinai. Israel begins to withdraw from Sinai. The peace treaty is signed. And immediately after the peace treaty is signed, Brzezinski, National Security Council advisors are still focused on trying to get the PLO involved, still trying to get the PLO to participate in negotiations, and they fail. Begin had a very negative view of the PLO, and he just wasn't going to deal with it.
So even at the state dinner the night of the peace treaty signing on March 26, 1979, Sadat talks about, we're immediately going to start working on these negotiations for the Palestinians. In the coming months, this is something that remains a priority. Why did the Jordanians get involved? Why didn't some other Palestinian representatives other than the PLO step up? How did they not move forward with this self-rule?
I think there are lots of reasons. I think the basic one is that Sadat at Camp David said he could speak for the Jordanians, and King Hussein, who was a very proud nationalist, said, no one's going to speak for me. Brzezinski goes out to Jordan in October, and he really makes the king very angry, because he's supposed to have a meeting with him at 4 o'clock, and the king is a little bit late, and he says something to one of the king's advisors, tell the king I have to leave in an hour and a half, I'm going to see Sadat. It was not a smart move. Now, when President Carter and I visited him on Jordan in March of 1983, the dislike or the anxiety that was between King Hussein and Carter was still palpable. You could still see it, you could feel it. The Jordanians weren't quite sure what was in it for them. What were they going to get out of this agreement? Were they going to get control over Jerusalem? Muslim control over Jerusalem? This had been negotiated for them. The PLO was not prepared at all to accept Israel's right to exist. It was still engaging in terrorism as these talks were going on. The Syrians absolutely wanted nothing to do with recognizing Israel at all. So the notion of going to a comprehensive peace, which the Carter administration started out with, was based on this assumption that the PLO and the Syrians were prepared. They were not prepared. As it turned out, Kissinger was right. You couldn't get a political agreement because it wasn't yet ripe. It took the PLO another 10 years to even put up their hand and say, okay, we'll recognize Israel. And then another 5 years before they actually signed an agreement with Israel recognizing Israel. Sadat was so far ahead of his time. He was so sui generis. He wanted something, he was impatient. He used the Americans to help him get it. And he was very lucky that Begin was willing to sign an agreement over Sinai, because Begin saw how important it was for Israel strategically and militarily.
Talk some more about how important it was to have Sadat and Begin and Carter as the three people who were in a position to make a treaty.
Begin and Sadat understood that their national interests would be advanced by reaching an agreement. They had will, they had courage, they had commitment. They were also able to bring along the domestic constituencies. Begin with a lot more difficulty than Sadat. They really had difficulty getting along with one another. They needed the mediator. And that's where the Americans played their role. And that's where Carter played his role. And not just Carter, but the State Department had some terrifically talented people who did a lot of the mediations, a lot of the drafting, a lot of the shuttle diplomacy that went on in 1978 and after the treaty. Some really talented folks. And they helped Carter and Brzezinski and Vance reach this agreement. I've often thought, what happens if it had been another president? You know, if Ronald Reagan had been president, would he have been able to go to Camp David with Begin and Sadat? I don't think he had the personality for it. Maybe Clinton. I'm not certain that Obama might have.
Well, I mean, so it could have been Gerald Ford.
It could have been Gerald.
1976 was a very close election. Would Gerald Ford have been able to? A fellow University of Michigan guy, could he have pulled it off for her?
Maybe, because Kissinger probably would have stayed on as Secretary of State. And I think Sadat wanted more comprehensive movement because he didn't want to be the only person who was negotiating agreements with Israel in 74 and 75? It's hard to know. If Begin had been elected and Rabin had stayed in office, would the Israelis have looked to the Jordanians for an agreement rather than focusing on Sinai? I mean, what ifs are fun to argue about,
Sure.
but you really don't know. The durability of this agreement, 40 years later, is that both Egypt and Israel still see it's in their respective national interests to have a common quiet border, because they have other issues with which they have to contend. And they both realize it's not in their interest to break the treaty. That's the reason that there's a durability, because the national interest is still sustained. And you have to ask the question, what would the national interest be for the PLO and for Israel to reach an agreement today? What does the PLO get? It gets only part of Western Palestine? What does Israel get? Does Israel receive maybe a demilitarized Palestinian state on its border? Is it willing to give up the security border along the Jordan River? Sinai was very different than the West Bank. Begin was very different than Rabin. Sadat was so totally different than Arafat. I mean, you had the right people at the right time who made some compromises, who created a lot of difficulties after the treaty. The Jordanian-American relationship was not smooth. The American-Saudi relationship was not smooth. And the Israeli-American relationship was really rough, 79 and 80.
There's a whole lot of focus on this 5-year period after the treaty signing, in the negotiation of the treaty.
Mm-hmm.
In that period, Sadat gets assassinated, Begin leaves office, Israel invades Lebanon,
Bombs the Iraqi reactor in 1981.
bombs the Iraqi reactor. Iran obviously becomes this Islamist state. But is all that why the negotiations went nowhere, or there weren't negotiations? I mean, what happened in this idea of there would be these self-rule, something going on with the people who lived in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and they're just, what happened?
Well, first of all, Reagan was on Carter.
Okay.
Reagan had a very different view of foreign policy. I didn't think he wanted to mess around with what was really looked like a very sticky issue as far as Palestinian autonomy was concerned. He had his own issue with the Secretary of State, Haig, and then Schultz. I think the Reagan administration had a totally different focus. Was not interested in something that's comprehensive. And the Palestinian issue didn't have this passionate motivational force that lit this Bunsen burner under Jimmy Carter. Because Carter saw the Palestinians as a civil rights movement. He saw them as people who needed a homeland. The interesting part about Carter is after he left office, he didn't speak about the success of the Camp David Accords. He said this was the beginning of a comprehensive peace which the Israelis did not sustain. The Israelis were never interested in a comprehensive peace. With Carter's marketing, Carter's position was the same that it was when he took office in January of 77. It was the same as it was when he left office. And I've traveled enough with him in the Middle East to know, and read enough of his op-eds since. He still is of the belief that the Israelis violated the principle of a comprehensive peace by not permitting the Palestinians to devolve into a Palestinian state. But the Israelis never promised that. That was in Carter's mind. And that's what he has been promoting ever since he's left office.
So it was relatively easy for Israel to give up Sinai for peace, because Sinai was never seen as part of Israel. As you said, it's tough to see what the enduring national interests are between the Palestinians and the Israelis now in reaching some sort of agreement. Mm-hmm. What will it take from a leadership perspective to get to this two-state solution that most people seem to see as the inevitable goal, if not necessarily end, of two peoples living side by side in peace or something in some day. How do we get there?
The reason that Camp David worked, the reason that the Egyptian-Israeli treaty was negotiated, because it didn't have violence going on simultaneously when they had the negotiations going on, number one. So it wasn't this high measure of mistrust. I mean, there was dislike, if not distaste, between the Egyptians and the Israelis. Let's not make no mistake about it. They weren't about to go out and have a beer together. Although there were times in these negotiations when they got pretty close and they began to understand each other, they were both human beings. I think it will take a long time for the Palestinians to accept the notion that Israel, 6 million Palestinians, and maybe most in the Arab world, to accept the notion that Israel is here to stay. For the PLO to accept Israel, it has to give up one of its number one ideological concepts. And that is the Palestinians who left in 48 have the right to come back. And the Israelis would never agree to that. So can one side of this equation give up a central core of its belief, namely the return of refugees? Can Israelis entrust their security on their eastern border to someone else, given the turmoil that exists now in Syria, uncertainty about Iraq, and certainly with Iran sitting out there? In other words, the conditions today surrounding the area of Western Palestine, the West Bank, Israel, Gaza, are so different than they were in 77, 78, 79. The leadership is so different. The Palestinians today are so divided and almost politically dysfunctional. And the Israelis are so divided internally in terms of will they seek to reach an agreement even if they know what all the details are. It's going to take a lot longer. Remember, the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations started immediately after the 73 war. It's 6 years in which they pounded away at these ideas. We don't have any doubt about what a two-state solution might look like. Well, we do have a doubt about who's going to provide the funds for it. We're going to get the $2 billion a year to subsidize the Palestinian economy for 5 to 7 years. When you look at the details, what you realize from the Camp David negotiations and the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations, the devil is in the details. Mm-hmm. Merely having an idea, you want a comprehensive peace, or wanting a two-state solution, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, as you said in Yiddish, when you get down to tachlis, the details really do matter. And it's not just something that you can brush aside. What you might need is a period of time where there's a measure of trust, nonviolence, non-hatred in their media that allows this to unfold. But this is not something that's going to be done at the White House because it's the great plan of the 21st century. It takes time, it takes trust, it takes a commitment on both sides. And the people have got to come along with their leaders.
So we can't have a U.S. president just take a couple of guys up into the Catoctin Mountains in Maryland for 2 weeks, and they'll come walking out and say, "Here we are."
Not unless you have pre-negotiations.
Gotcha. Do we have any questions? All right, then we'll keep going. One of the things that is always talked about out of all these negotiations is the question of settlements. It took only, we didn't talk about it earlier, but right after Camp David, the accords are signed, immediately Carter and Begin are having a clash about settlements. What do we know from the documents that you've looked at in the past year, really, that have shown what was the dispute and what really happened about the settlements?
Well, it's one of these controversies. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? No notes were taken by Americans the night before the Camp David Accords were signed in September of 1978. Vance comes out of the meeting and he says, I think we have an agreement. Carter had wanted a moratorium on all building of settlements for 5 years, or for the duration of the negotiations, which was broadly meant Palestinian autonomy negotiations. Begin said he never made that promise. And according to the notes of the person who was there, Aaron Barak, who was the note taker for the Israelis, his notes clearly say that Begin never made that promise. Problem was the next day, Carter, next day or the day after, he goes before the U.S. Congress and he said, I have a promise that there'll be no building of settlements for the duration of negotiations. And Begin immediately goes public and says, that's not what I said. And then you have the flaming of the differences between them over the settlements. If only the settlements was the issue that separated the Americans and the Israelis after Camp David ended, that might have not been as bad as all the other disagreements that began to unfold between the Carter administration and Israel. The Carter administration, either voluntarily or involuntarily, was a party to 2 UN resolutions that called the territories taken in '67 occupied.
Including East Jerusalem.
Including Jerusalem. Right? There were other issues of the constant squiring of the PLO. Begin had said in his debate on whether the Camp David Accords should be ratified, he said in the debate in the parliament, he called the PLO as bad as the Nazis. That's not an insignificant statement in the sense of trying to understand how deeply abhorrent he felt the PLO was at the time. You cannot remove people's mistrust. Their formative years help shape who they become and what their outlooks are. Maybe what we see today between the Israelis and the Palestinians, with maybe some changes in the territories to make life a little bit better economically, whatever would need to be done for the Palestinians, maybe this is as good as it's going to get. Maybe it's not replicable. Maybe a 2-state solution is just a dream. And you have to look at reality. And not think with your heart, but think with your head. And for some people, that's really tough to do. I mean, it's to Jimmy Carter's credit, he got them to Camp David, that he pulled them along, but it's Begin and Sadat's credit that they knew they had to have an agreement between them and not spoil their respective relationships in the long haul with the United States. Anyway.
So in the end, a mediator can't force people to make a deal that they don't want to get before you get to the table anyway.
I think that's the best lesson to be learned, Michael, is that the mediator cannot want it more than the respective sides.
All right. Well, I think, is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap this up?
Thank you.
Well, I want to say that you can find out a lot more about the Camp David negotiations, the Blair House negotiations that followed that led to the treaty. You can find documents. You can find some delightful whiteboard videos that some about Camp David. We'll have some coming up soon about the treaty. If you go to the Center for Israel Education website at israeled.org. And don't forget that if you like our work, you can always hit the donate button and help us keep doing it. Ken, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everybody out there.